Good morning, everyone. Sorry for these technical issues we have been experiencing. Today I will be talking to you about a work that we've conducted last year at the University of Reading under the supervision of Vesna Stojanovic and Emma Pagnamenta, where we explored word learning in children with DLD. And in particular, we wanted to gather evidence for the encoding hypothesis and the contribution of working memory in word learning in this client group. So why is it important to consider word learning in children with DLD in general? Some studies have observed that despite children with DLD perform below the typically developing peers on measures of vocabulary, they still perform within range. So apparently there seemed to not to be an issue. However, we know that measures of vocabulary do not necessarily reflect someone's lexical knowledge, because, for example, if we think about a receptive vocabulary task, children might, for example, use a go by exclusion, right, to identify the target. So that not necessarily represents someone's ability to use that lexical label. In fact, it seems that children lexical knowledge, children with DLD have a limited lexical knowledge that is limited in depth and breadth. So it's in this regard, it's important to then consider word learning, because it gives us more idea of what actually happens when these kids are exposed to new words, so how their learning unfolds. And Khan and Windsor in 2010 conducted a first meta-analysis on word learning in children with DLD. They included 28 studies that tested children's ability to acquire new words throughout experimental paradigms. So they actually observed the mechanism of word learning, but they only focused on fast mapping, which is the very early stage of word learning when we are exposed to the phonological form, and after very limited exposure, we try to match that phonological form to a meaning. According to the encoding hypothesis, is a difficult encoding that prevents the later stages of word learning in children with DLD. So consolidation of new words and retention of them seem to be comparable between children with DLD and typically developing children. However, the difficulty in the encoding, which is the first stage after we're first exposed to the word, seems to prevent the acquisition of new words in this clinical population. The evidence for these hypotheses comes from study that have explored word learning across multiple days. So they went beyond the first stage of encoding and just actually explored what happens after that first day. And what they observed, so we've got two examples. One is a study by Bishop and one is from Jackson. And what they observed is that there is definitely a gap between typically developing children and children with DLD in the first day, which reflects the encoding stage. And then the gap remains the same across different days. So the pattern of learning is the same between the two groups, and the difference between groups at the later stages is actually the result of that of the difficulty in that initial stage. So what factors contribute to the encoding of new words? We know that both previously lexical knowledge and verbal working memory are necessary for the encoding of new lexical forms. And this is because when we are exposed to a new spoken word, we need to identify each sound that the word is comprised of. and that sequence needs to be temporarily retained in verbal working memory. But at the same time, we do not necessarily process single sounds, because we can actually recognize in the phonological label a chunk that we had previously stored in our lexicon, because it belonged to some other words that were already stored in our lexicon. And that chunk can be recognized as it is. So both these aspects, both these cognitive domains are necessary and support the acquisition of new words. And interestingly, children with DLD can experience weaknesses in both these aspects. So what were the aims of our study? We wanted to identify which stage of word learning is challenging for children with DLD. So we wanted to go beyond the previous meta-analysis that only explored the very early stages and explore every stage, so encoding, consolidation, and retention. We wanted to understand the contribution of lexical knowledge and working memory. And we also thought it would be relevant to explore what are the task characteristics that highlight the gap between groups. This is just an overview of the selection procedure. So we retrieved 1,410 studies, but we all included 40, and we all included studies that used a group comparison design where they compared children with DLD defined according to the catalyzed criteria released by Bishop and children with typical development that were of the same age. And the studies had to have explored word learning throughout experimental paradigms. So obviously there was a huge variety in the outcome measures used across studies. Some studies use comprehension tasks, some studies use naming tasks, and some studies use descriptions tasks and recognition tasks. We decided to accept all of these outcome measures because obviously they reflect different aspects of the knowledge that a child builds when they learn new words. And then we thought we would actually explore the effect of different outcome measures in the analysis. And the studies could have used these assessing tasks at different points in times. So immediately after the training, which reflected encoding, after repeated training, which reflected consolidation, and sometimes after the end of the training, which reflected retention. So consistently, what we highlight being the factors that contribute to encoding of new words. We, in our moderator analysis, we consider some participant characteristics that were receptive and expressive vocabulary, as well as non-word repetition and verbal short-term memory. And in terms of task characteristics, we explore the effect of the number of words included in the task, the maximum length of the target, and the quantity of exposure to each target. Our analysis was divided in two stages. In the first, we conducted a first general analysis where we explored the group differences in encoding, consolidation, and retention, calculating Cohen's d. Importantly, for consolidation and retention, we subtracted the baseline for the final scores, and that is because we wanted to obtain a measure that only described what happened to that specific age without possibly, carry effects of the previous stages spilling over the later stages. And then we conducted a moderator analysis, which also took place in two steps. We first explored the effect of each moderator independently with a random effect model. And then we fitted all the moderators and identified the best fit of the model with automated model selection. So the results, first of all, highlighted a huge gap in the literature, because as we can see, we had there was a huge disproportion between the effects that we could calculate for encoding and the effects that we could calculate for consolidation and retention. In fact, all of the studies include information on encoding, but only a small minority on consolidation or retention. So we have robust evidence of difficulties in encoding, because the two groups, children with DLD and children with typical development, were significantly different in the ability of encoding words across studies. In fact, Cohen's d was 0.88, whereas we did not, in our data set, we did not observe this difference at the later stages. So in consolidation and retention abilities, actually the two groups did not differ. In terms of moderator, for the sample characteristics or participant characteristics that played the most significant role, was verbal short-term memory, which was the most significant predictor, whereas receptive vocabulary approached significant levels but wasn't really significant. And consistently with the contribution of verbal short-term memory, we found that the task characteristic that was that moderated encoding difficulties was the length of the items. So children with DLD tended to show most significant difficulties in tasks that included longer words. So why are these? Overall, what we found was that there is robust evidence of encoding difficulties for children with DLD. Verbal short-term memory was the main predictor. So therefore, it seems that there is a correlation between short-term memory and difficulty in acquiring new words in this population. So children with lower verbal short-term memory are also the children that struggled the most in acquiring new words. And the gap between the groups was more significant for the studies that included tasks with longer stimuli. So why are these results important for our clinical practice? First of all, they highlight the importance of considering word learning, because it's not really a domain that we tend to consider. We tend to text just the kids' lexicon, but we do not really consider their ability to learn new words, so it deserves attention. And also the role played by verbal short-term memory, pay attention, because it might be necessary to support this domain and this group of clients. At the same time, if we're targeting in our intervention other linguistic domains, it might be best to use shorter words rather than longer to avoid overloading them. So obviously the study wasn't free from limitation. So in fact, we had very limited data for consolidation and retention. So obviously our conclusions are based on only the data that we could retrieve. We could only explore verbal short-term memory, but we didn't find, we couldn't really explore the contribution of central executive loaded component of working memory, because studies just did not include that information. And also there was very little overlap between the information on participants reported across studies. So actually that obviously that impacted the moderator analysis. So the questions are the questions now or at the end? Sorry, did you say, Kim, that
we're going to have questions at the end, Paola. So there are a couple of questions that people have put in the comments tab. Could I ask you to transfer those to the Q&A tab? Because there's, I'm really sorry, there's a lot of IT issues going on, and a lot of the comments in the chat are about the IT issues. So in order to assist me to find the questions at the end, can you please add questions to the Q&A tab, because that would really help me out. So thank you very much, Paola.
Okay.
So you can have a look at the questions that you will be asked at the end.
Okay.
Lucy, do you want to have a go at sharing your slides?
I just wanted to check that you can hear me okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, lovely. So sorry about that. I'm just hearing myself back at the moment. It's doing a weird thing, but it should be fine. Let me just have a look here. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, so I can see your screen back again, not your slides. Paula, can you mute yourself to hopefully reduce the echo?
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me just have a look.
So we've lost your screen now, Lucy. I've given you a share link there.
Okay. How is that?
Got your browser view again.
Okay, so not the slides.
No.
Okay, because they're on my browser at the moment, which is why I'm a bit confused. Did you get the email with my slides in?
Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah, if that's okay.
So can you see that?
I can't because I'm having some technical issues, but other people probably can, I'm guessing. Oh yes, so other people can, I can't, but that's okay. I can kind of make it work with that.
Okay.
If you're okay, Kim.
Yeah, just tell me next.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you're on the title page at the moment. Yeah, lovely. So yeah, I'm so sorry everybody for these kind of technical issues we're having today. My laptop isn't really playing ball at the moment, but hopefully I'll be able to give a pretty decent presentation otherwise. And yeah, hopefully you can kind of hear me okay. That's the main thing. And any questions afterwards, do just let me know, obviously. So now we'll go on to the second page. So that's just what I'm aiming to talk about today. So today I'm going to be talking about our systematic review and how our steering group were involved within this kind of systematic review process. And it's actually part of a larger project which has 4 phases in it. And the aim of the project overall is to develop a intervention for preschool children with co-occurring features of SSD and DLD. And so within this, our project steering group are overseeing the entire process. And today we're just going to focus in on the impact of that steering group input into our systematic review. And the aim of this systematic review was to look at interventions for preschool SSD and DLD, compare and contrast them and see what we can learn from them in developing this intervention. Okay, so we can now go on to the next page, the next slide, which is titled Why a Mixed Steering Group. So if you do 2 clicks, 2 quotes should come up for this slide. So the reason I have a mixed research steering group really comes from my pre-doctoral work when I worked with clinicians and parents to decide actually what's the best way for us to develop this intervention. And it turns out there was a really strong preference for professionals and parents to come together to develop it in the same group rather than in separate groups. So hence what you're seeing on these slides here. So that's 2 quotes. The first quote is from a speech and language therapist from one of the SENDs I presented at. And the second quote is from Dave, who is one of our parent advisory group members. So hopefully you can see those quotes okay on that slide. Okay. So now we'll go on to the next slide, which is titled Our Steering Group. So here is our steering group together. So you should be able to see a list of names and some pictures of our steering group members. So we do have professionals. We've got 3 speech and language therapists. That's Miriam, Emma, and Natalie. We've got people with lived experience. So that's Dave, who is a parent of a child with DLD. We have Sophie, who's an adult with DLD. We have Laura, who's a specialist early years teacher, and we also have Patricia, who works in the Brighton Ethnic Minority Achievement Service. And this service works really closely with the RCSLT down there to provide support for children who have SSD or DLD, but English might not be their first language. And that's what I really wanted to kind of hone in on with this group is, yes, let's get a diverse range of people in terms of lived experience, but thinking of different layers of that lived experience. So again, with Patricia, her knowledge of bi-multilingualism, which is personal as well. And also Miriam with her EDI experience. And some of you might know her as one of the founders from SLT Tea Time. So now we'll go on to the next slide, which is titled, It's Just a Review of the Literature, Why Involve People? So yeah, when we think of PPI, the first thing we think of might not be, oh, we'll look at some literature together, or we'll see what's kind of reported out there. And actually, even in BMJ Open in 2023, I've seen publications that have been published where there's been no PPI key stakeholder engagement at all, which would kind of suggest it's not essential. But I'd like to kind of convince you that actually it is really important, it is really essential. So we're going to take a little deeper dive into that now. So now we're going to go on to the slide, which is titled Levels of Involvement. So this is taken from the Levels of Involvement Cochrane resource, which I'd really recommend. It's free and it's very easy to follow. Excellent training on how you can involve people in different ways within systematic reviews or any kind of literature review. And these levels of involvement go from kind of just involving people by giving them information, so at that receiving level at the bottom, to actually your PPI group leading on the research itself. And on their website, they give some really nice concrete examples of each level and what it would look like. So today I'm really going to focus on one aspect of our work together, which was our steering group work, where we looked at what data we wanted to extract from our papers. So what we wanted to find out about these interventions that are published and what the impact of that is on the intervention we're developing. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide, please. So this one is called Data to Extract, What's Important. So we had some focused one-to-one meetings with individuals from the steering group. And then we all came together in a whole group meeting to discuss actually what data is important to extract from everybody's kind of personal perspectives, but also group perspectives as well. And we recorded these changes made to the extraction form on what we call an impact log. So on this slide, if you click, you should be able to see a table at the bottom, which is an example of the impact log from a discussion that I had with Sophie. So we had our one-to-one and we talked about, it was really lovely actually, she was saying about how when she had SLT as a youngster, she really enjoyed it, it was fun. It's really stimulated discussion around the importance of the child's view of the intervention. And actually, when we're looking at these interventions that are published, what did the kids who were doing it think about the interventions? So that's why we added this to our extraction form. So that's just one example. So now we can go on to the next slide, which is titled Making Sense Together. So fast forward 3 months, I've done some literature searches, I've extracted some data. I go back to the group and unfortunately I have to tell them there's actually not a lot of information included in these intervention studies that people, that they flagged up that they really wanted. So we thought, okay, well, what are we going to do with this? We can't just leave it, right? We need to learn from it. So we split up into 2 subgroups, and we did a brainstorming session of kind of what information was missing, why does it actually matter, and maybe have some ideas about what we can do about it. How can we make this into a positive and build on this? So I'm going to give you 2 examples of that. So the next slide is titled Impact Example 1. So here you'll see an example from, based on our discussion around the decision around whether the child accessed the intervention was basically about their clinical profile. But as we know, in early years speech and language therapy, there's a lot of other people and factors involved, particularly parents, right? So we very much discussed the importance of involving parents within that decision-making process, and not just saying this intervention is right for you because you tick all of these clinical boxes. So that's why we're looking at incorporating what we call a shared decision-making support tool into the intervention itself, so it becomes a joint decision-making process between the therapist and the parent and the family involved. So now we can go on to the next slide, which is titled Impact Example 2. So yeah, in a lot of the intervention studies we found, bi and multilingual children weren't always assessed in their home language, which there are many issues with this. I mean, practically, obviously, we don't know what their language levels are, but more widely, like, what message is this sending to their family? And we really want to encourage them to use that language that their family is most comfortable in and is part of their culture. We don't want to take that away from them. So again, we had some discussions around this, and as a consequence of this, we are in phase 4 of this project. We're going to do some specific work with bi and multilingual families about how we can best tailor this intervention to their needs, as well as monolingual families, and actually how can we communicate it in a positive way to them, that it's a positive that English might not be their first language rather than an inconvenience. So now we're going to go on to the next slide, which is titled My Reflections. So my first reflection was, within these Cochrane levels of involvement, I was thinking, well, how can people really lead? How can your PPI group really lead? And for me, that's tricky because I'm a PhD researcher. I kind of have to have led on this. But if you do want your PPI group to lead, there's a lot of funding, a lot of training involved in that. So just be aware of that. And my personal thoughts on it are that it's better to involve people maybe at one of those lower levels and do it really well than to encourage your PPI group to properly lead on it, but not doing a very good job or being disingenuous about it. My next reflection was my reflexivity, and this whole process has really made me reflect on the impact of my own bias. You know, I'm white, I'm monolingual, I don't have DLD, I'm not a parent of a child with DLD. So actually it's been really like thought-provoking, just me being involved in some of those discussions, and challenging, but really challenging in a good way. My third reflection is that it's really important, obviously, the ethics. When we were going through the extraction form together and people were raising like what they thought was important, I did have to be honest and say, I can see why this is really important to you, but I suspect we might not find a lot of information on this. So just like setting those expectations, but still kind of recognizing it's important to look for those things, because otherwise, how are we going to evidence that those things aren't there if we don't even try to begin with? And then my final reflection was, well, just plan as early as you can. That's more just a recommendation to anyone else who's looking to do something like this in the future. Think about your budgeting for your PPI group. And just think really carefully about how long it will take to kind of do kind of group meetings if you want to, one-to-one meetings. And I would say it always takes longer than you initially thought for. Okay, so nearly there now. So we're now going to go on to personal reflections of group members. So that's the next slide. And this is the interesting bit. So I had a one-to-one meeting with each group member. We've been putting these slides together ourselves, so they're aware of the content of the slides. And we just talked about actually what's the impact of them being a part of this work. So firstly, we got Natalie, who says, it gives me a sense of agency. And we talked about how, as a therapist, often you kind of consume research or you read research, but actually there's something quite empowering about being a part of research or trying to change things for the future. Next, we have Sophie, who said it's nice to work with all different people in little groups. And I thought this was a really lovely example of how you can involve people with DLD into like a mixed professional steering group, as long as you kind of think about how you tailor it. So for Sophie, it works really well that we split up into much smaller subgroups for our subgroup discussion. So next we've got Patricia, who said, pleased to be included from the point of view of a bilingual person with a multilingual family. Again, this was a lovely discussion and a really nice example of how we all have very multifaceted identities, right? So yeah, she's joined as a professional who works with multilingual children, but also she has that personal experience too. So it really shows that kind of richness that people can bring, and it's not just one-dimensional. We don't necessarily put them into the professional or lived experience box. Often they overlap. Next, we've got Miriam, who said, I didn't think about it that way. It gets you thinking about other things, which was basically in response to the whole group looking at the same thing, but just having totally different perspectives on it, or maybe a similar perspective, but just from a slightly different angle. And similar to Miriam, I've just found this absolutely fascinating, and I feel so lucky to be part of this. And finally, we have Dave, who says, as a parent who's lived through speech therapy and had many highs and lows, it's important to me to give back to the profession, albeit learning and ideas that could help change future generations of SLT. So again, that feeling of like really giving back to the profession and changing things for the better, making the future better. And even though like we found that this information is missing within kind of other interventions, we can work on this and we can like make sure that the intervention we're developing together really kind of addresses those key issues. So the next slide is the take-home message. So really, if your systematic review is about people, then involving them is definitely relevant. And you can involve people at all different levels in different ways. And it really depends on the individual project. And I'd recommend checking out that Cochrane guidance if you haven't done so already. But I would also say that within that PPI and that involving people, think about your diversity and the range of voices who are involved there, because we can't positively kind of support these kind of underserved groups if they're not included within any part of the intervention development process. So there is that, and I would recommend also the equality impact assessment for systematic reviews, which there is a link there on that slide. So the final slide, further information, I'd just like to give acknowledgements to my PhD supervisor and Dr. Sam Harding from Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Unit, who's collaborated with us on this work. Obviously the project steering group who helped me put these slides and the content for this together. Do feel free to send us an email or check out our website. And yeah, I'm sorry for kind of the technical glitches, but hopefully you've enjoyed what I've managed to give you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and I hope I was okay there for you on the slides. Annabelle, I am going to do the ask to screen share. So did that pop through for you?
It did, but annoyingly, it's my whole screen. So that's the only option. I'm sorry. So I'm going to
if I put that up, can you see my slides now rather than the chat?
I can see your slides, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you everyone for bearing with us, and I'm so sorry if you still can't access any of what we've been talking about. But yeah, Kim is expertly trying to navigate it. So thank you, Kim, for just, yeah, being resilient through all of these difficulties. As a reminder, I can't see anyone or the chat or anything. So if anything goes wrong, please do just interrupt me, Kim. Thank you. So my name is Annabelle Burnley. I'm a psychologist from the University of Bath, and I've just finished my PhD, which was developing and piloting Pluto, which is a new sort of parent-led intervention. It's a treatment online that helps to improve the psychosocial skills of children with developmental language disorder, and it's what I'll be speaking through today. To give you a little bit of an outline as to what I will be speaking through. So first, I'll give a bit of an overview of the psychosocial difficulties of children with DLD. Then, not dissimilar to some of Lucy's work that she just spoke through, we took a real person-based approach to intervention development. So I'll be giving a bit of an overview of that. Then talk you through the pilot study, design, methodology, and summary of findings, as well as giving a couple of case examples to provide a bit of more context around these findings before going towards future directions, and then maybe giving some ideas as to how people could get involved in the future. So in regards to the psychosocial difficulties of children with DLD, it has been sort of widely acknowledged they have sort of a much higher rate of internalizing symptoms than their typically developing peers, and that is sort of represented by 6 times the rate of anxiety and about 3 times the rate of depression than these typically developing peers, as well as somatic complaints, things like tummy aches, headaches that are associated with psychological difficulties. Also high rates of externalizing symptoms, so lots of hyperactivity, which often comes through with comorbid ADHD diagnoses, as well as conduct behaviours, and a number of different peer problems too, so either being much more socially withdrawn or even rated as more unpopular than their typically developing peers. Despite this, though, there are currently no psychosocial interventions that have been developed specifically for children with DLD. And as hopefully most of us on the call will be aware, given how prevalent it is, this is quite shocking. So the person-based approach we've taken over the last 3 years in order to come up with perhaps a solution to these psychological problems. The Pluto intervention didn't come out of nowhere. So we started off in the first year with the planning stage, which was very mixed methods, speaking to lots of parents of children with DLD, adults with DLD, then running survey studies to get a bit more sort of quantifying, to quantify the findings basically in a wider sample in order to propose what we call the guiding principles of the intervention. These we then took through to an optimization stage where we consulted with what we've referred to as key stakeholders, which included speech and language therapists, clinical psychologists, so those who are experienced in delivering these kinds of interventions to children with DLD, as well as a select number of parents with children with DLD. So again, really focusing on that sort of service user perspective there. And this helps us refine the guiding principles and ultimately finalize the intervention design and further develop it. And then the evaluation stage, which was this last year, we have piloted the study, and that's what I'm going to be talking through today. There are a couple of references just at the bottom of this slide if you're interested in some of the published work from that first stage that I just mentioned. So the Pluto program, it's a very multi-component intervention, and I've got a QR code that it will jump around the screen on different slides, but if you're interested in accessing our website and finding out more, you can scan the QR code at any point and hopefully it will take you straight there. But what the Pluto program effectively did is first, it was 6 modules, 6 different focuses, and it was delivered online over a period of up to 12 weeks. The first module focused specifically on what is DLD, and this really came from information from parents around the fact that at the point of their child's diagnosis, they felt really unequipped and uninformed as to what on earth DLD meant, what it meant for the psychosocial difficulties of their child, and what it meant for the future, and how to advocate for their child. So that was a real focus for the first week of getting everyone on the same page and just making sure everyone understood what the diagnosis meant in the first place.
Module 2 then focused on your child's emotion regulation skills. So we used a lot of visual techniques and non-verbal techniques to start exploring emotions in the household, things like feelings thermometers and zones of regulation that perhaps some practitioners might be familiar with. Module 3 then focused on managing child anxiety. So here we used, again, a lot of non-verbal adaptations of things from CBT, things like storyboarding to really help visually and creatively break down situations into sort of its finer parts and help the child and parents understand what emotions are being felt, why, and how perhaps navigating around things like intolerance of uncertainty or changes to routine. So that was what that module focused on there. Module 4 then actually looked back at parent stress management. And again, this was very much informed by a lot of the feedback from parents in the earlier stages that at that point of diagnosis, they felt completely isolated and often were at the point of burnout in terms of trying to navigate and advocate for their child in every single situation, and were finding it very, very stressful. So we wanted to provide a week where parents had to sort of focus back in on themselves and check in on how they're doing. Module 5 then focused back on the child and building child confidence. Again, a lot of visual and creative tasks there, things like a treasure box of bravery and things like that. And module 6 focusing back on the outside world, so non-verbal communication and what does the future look like as a child with DLD. And here we used a lot of materials back from the adult interviews we've done in stage 1 to provide parents an illustration of what adulthood with DLD can look like, to again, perhaps more for the parents and the child's sake, give them some reassurance that it doesn't, the future can be exciting rather than full of trepidation. And as I mentioned, it was all provided online, as well as any PDF copies that were sent via email if the parents wanted to print out various activities. But this is what the platform looked like. You had the module access on the side to the left, and the parents could navigate it as and when they had time. So in terms of the pilot trial, we recruited 10 participants into the study, all of whom had to be fluent in written and spoken English, but could be from anywhere. Their child had to be between 6 and 11 years old and have a confirmed diagnosis of DLD. We recruited all of these parents through social media or Engage with DLD or EDLD, which is an online database basically that helps connect researchers with families from the community. And all parents and children were recruited in October to December 2022. So in terms of the sort of study design, in terms of quantitative data collection, we used an interrupted time series design, which effectively means we had a number of weekly data points that we collected for, you can see up to 5 weeks there, as depicted by the blue dots at the beginning, the multiple baseline period before the intervention. And then we had multiple time points that we collected data after the intervention too. And this really allowed for 2 things. One, to get an idea of any longer term impact, any trends before and after in the child's emotional symptoms, because obviously they fluctuate from week to week, but also allow the baseline data to act as each family's own control group. If there's any questions about this, please do just get in contact. And as mentioned, we collected data on a weekly database, on a weekly time frame. I will be focusing on these weekly measures for this presentation, and what we collected was we used the short form of the SDQ, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, in order to get an idea of the child's psychosocial difficulties, a parent report of emotion regulation, as well as their own well-being and through the adult well-being scale. And then we also used a creative version of the state and trait anxiety inventory to get a weekly report of the child's own perspective on what their anxiety was like. And then how we analysed this data was, firstly, we did a bit of a visual analysis. This is an example of Joni, a family, Joni and Susan. This is Joni's data and her emotional symptoms. So what this effectively means is it allows us to, because we've got so many time points, we can have a look at what the general trend is for that family over the time periods. You've got baseline on the left, intervention in the middle, and follow-up on the right. And what we could see here from Joni and Susan is that Joni's emotional symptoms were pretty high at the beginning, at the baseline, have stably kind of gone down throughout the intervention and stabilized a little in follow-up, though there is an indication they could be going back up at the end of that follow-up period. So what we could see from this is that there might be more follow-up that's needed. What we also did was we calculated improvement rate differences using the clinical outcomes approach. Again, this is quite a complicated, hard to explain approach. If you're interested, please do get in contact. But effectively what you're doing is you're looking at the number of overlaps between the data at baseline and follow-up, and in order to understand sort of what the ratio of how many data points are reliably above and below each other at those two different points. In terms of the qualitative data collection and analysis, so we took in the moment feedback on feasibility and efficacy using 15-minute phone calls across that initial, across the intervention delivery period, which is indicated in the middle here with a slightly more simplified overview of the intervention, as well as taking and collecting semi-structured follow-up interviews, which lasted about 60 minutes, and that was right at the end of the follow-up. And we analysed this data using interpretive phenomenological analysis, and that really just allowed us to keep the context of each family at the heart of the analysis and their own unique experiences. In terms of the characteristics of the participants, so we got a pretty good a spread of male and female children, a nice spread across the ages of 6 to 11 years old, though most of the children were 9 years old, in the middle there with 4 of them. A good spread of income amongst the families. Now this was stratified around the average UK income. Most families were from the UK, but we did get one from America and one from Ireland. Now, the first point of bias to really keep in mind, or that we've kept in mind, is that a lot of the parents that were recruited were relatively highly educated. So you can see half of the sample there have a postgraduate degree, which is obviously not reflective of the general UK population. And additionally, despite the fact that we had a couple of families that were multilingual or first generation immigrants, all families were white, which again is a very important consideration when looking towards implementation and dissemination of the intervention. When the children were first recruited into the trial, this gives an overview of what the symptoms were like at this point. So what we can see on the sort of left side there is using the SDQ, this is the parent report of internalizing and externalizing symptoms. And what we can see is the majority of children had at least slightly raised internalizing symptoms. So as a reminder, this is things like anxiety and low mood. And then a smaller number of them had externalizing symptoms. And knowing the families, although externalizing symptoms can include things like hyperactivity and conduct, the majority of these children that did display raised or high externalizing symptoms, it was specific to hyperactivity. And then in terms of the child reports of their own anxiety, very interestingly, really echoed what the parents were saying. So about half of the children did report themselves to have high levels of anxiety at baseline, so before the intervention. And we also collected data on the parents' own well-being. And again, you see a very similar thing here. So majority of the parents at the point of recruitment had high levels of anxiety. We also collected data on inward and outward irritability, and less of, I guess, that perhaps indication of behavioural difficulties in the parent at baseline. Now for a first summary of results, out of the 10 that we recruited, 8 families were able to engage successfully in the Pluto intervention, which was fantastic. And of these 8, 5 families experienced significant positive changes in child emotional symptoms. These effect sizes were largest for anxiety and mood, so the internalizing sort of symptoms and emotional symptoms, whereas emotion regulation remained very stable for most. And I'll reflect on this in a little bit just in the case studies. In addition to this, 4 parents also experienced significant positive changes in their well-being. Now, this impact was specific to the different family circumstances, what was happening in the household, whether all parents were at work and very busy, how long ago their child had received the diagnosis, and how well supported they felt. So lots of other factors to consider there in terms of the adults' own mental health, but it was really brilliant to see that for 4 parents, they had experienced significant positive changes. In terms of the qualitative insights, the main benefits that parents reported were things like improving emotional communication in the family, managing stressful situations, and of course, when you're tracking families over a 6-month period, critical instances do arise, and a lot of the families felt that this Pluto intervention and these alternative communication exercises really helped them manage these stressful situations. It also helped, they felt, increase their child's own self-awareness of their emotions, as well as their parents' understanding of their child's difficulties, and particularly how their language difficulties may relate to their psychosocial difficulties. There were a number of barriers to engagement to consider though. So first, the child's stage of development, particularly a couple of the children who were 6 years old, they did struggle to engage as easily with some of the more complex tasks. So the things that involved, reflecting on what you're thinking and being able to engage with some of the language that was used. So that's definitely a point of learning for us and a point of reflection. There was also a number of busy family schedules, lots of children in the household, as I say, multiple jobs, and that really affected the parents' ability to sit down with their child in the evening and go through the exercises. And not dissimilarly, child externalizing difficulties. So for a couple of the children, they either had ADHD or very high levels of hyperactivity as reported by the parent. And this again created a bit of a frustration and tension in the household when after school, when the children are already exhausted, having to try and get them to calm down, sit down and do what effectively some children saw as more work. Now, to give a little bit of further context, just very briefly, with a couple of case studies, Susan and Joni and Fionn, Evan and Reese are the two families I'll just be very briefly introducing now. Both white British, both from proportionally low income families. Fionn, Evan and Reese were bilingual, Susan and Joni monolingual, and they both family groups had reached a school level of education. So Susan and Joni, this is actually the chart that I showed you earlier. As you can see with the improvement rate difference on the left, and they had a high effect of the intervention, which, as I say, you can see through the very significant decrease of Joni's emotional symptoms throughout the intervention, then stabilizing at follow-up. And what Susan really said is it's just been nice to talk to Joni almost for the first time about these sorts of feelings. And that did surprise me a bit, her responsiveness to it. So for a lot of parents, they kind of had just avoided these kinds of conversations around emotions in fear that their child wouldn't engage or wouldn't understand. And so for a lot, it was actually really pivotal in sort of being actually, we can have these conversations and they're really powerful. In contrast, we've got Fionn, Evan and Reese. There was a slightly more moderate effect of the intervention here, shown by the improvement rate difference on the left again. And you can see here that, again, visually in the graph, there is less of an effect. But importantly, and as I mentioned before, when you are tracking families over a 6-month period, there are critical instances. And so in week 10, Reese received an ADHD diagnosis. And in week 12, they experienced a death in the family. And this, particularly the loss of his grandfather, it resulted in a lot of panic attacks and physical symptoms of anxiety within Reese. But what's important here is, I guess, taking into account those two critical instances. What Fionn and Evan said is that it's actually, the Pluto course has actually opened up conversations of why have you felt like that? Because before, he wouldn't really tell us how he felt. He'd just sort of get odd or start to cry. So what they felt the Pluto intervention had done was, yes, there was definitely this spike in his symptoms, but it really helped them all kind of communicate around this grief, around the complexities of death, and enable him to recover at a quicker, I guess, pace than perhaps they would have assumed before. Similarly, they said it has helped him express himself better. Instead of going from 0 to I want to kill you, we can go from 200 to 0 quite a lot better. So again, it's just that whole calming everyone down and understanding where the emotions are coming from within everyone. Now, I mentioned earlier that emotion regulation was far more stable across the intervention. And we've got, examples from Susan and Joni and Fionn, Evan and Reese here. On its own, I'm aware this chart perhaps doesn't depict quite how stable these were in comparison to the emotional symptoms. But if I do flick between this chart and the emotional symptoms, you can see how week by week, emotional symptoms were far more changeable than the emotion regulation symptoms, which is also very interesting in terms of, and I'd be interested to get your any of your clinical perspectives on this, where perhaps these two different mechanisms are working and how they relate to DLD. Regards to the future directions, so a lot of further intervention development work is sort of in the pipelines, hopefully. We would really like to prioritise engagement with minoritized families, again, acknowledging the very specific, I guess, biases that we had in our sample, and also increase feasibility amongst children with externalizing symptoms, those with more hyperactivity, as I mentioned. We'd also like to do a lot of implementation work, so bridge the gap between SLTs and clinical psychologists, where typically, from what we heard from parents, they feel like they're falling through the gap. And hopefully in the future, a randomized controlled trial that would help us understand the impact of the intervention across a larger sample and compare the effects of the intervention with both active and waitlist controls. Before I finish, I just wanted to acknowledge all the help and support from my wonderful team at Bath and Bristol, as well as the psychologists, the parent consultants, and the speech and language therapists that have helped us build and refine the intervention and then put it into practice. Now I think if I stop sharing, hopefully everyone's still there, and maybe we'll go to questions now.
So yeah, apologies from the contributions from Romeo. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for presentations. Apologies to the audience for the tech issues. I'm aware now that this is officially the end of this session. I think there is a break immediately after this session. So if people do want to hang around, I've got a question each that I've taken from the chat for each presenter. But if people do need to leave now, totally understand, and thanks once again to the presenters. If you've got 5 minutes and would like to listen to the questions, then do please stay on. So, Paola, the first question was for you. So in your presentation, you talked about short-term memory having a real impact on word learning. So there was a question in the chat about what have you seen in the evidence, or what do you know about what can we practically do as speech and language therapists to support where that short-term memory difficulties and therefore support word learning?
Thank you. So in general, I think we can't really say that verbal short-term memory does determine difficulties in learning new words. We can't really make that assumption. What we can say from the result is that it seems that children with lower verbal short-term memory tend to be the children that have more difficulties, but we can't really establish that causal relationship as yet. Verbal short-term memory, but I think in general it depends on if we've got a doubt as a clinician, then I think it's just something that we need to be aware of and therefore like investigate further. And if there is a difficulty, then I think it's worth considering intervention, and it's worth targeting an intervention. And there is evidence of some training that it can actually be improved. What we have limited in evidence so far is the transfer effect, so whether improving verbal short-term memory actually results in improving a specific linguistic domain that we want to target. But and that is actually our next step of our research. We will be testing that, do working memory training to support children with word learning difficulties. And the idea is that it actually there can be a transfer. So the literature is very fragmented in this. Depends what kind of training you are suggesting, and there has to be an overlap in the kind of task that you pick and in the linguistic domain that you want to target, because we can't assume that, I don't know, just recalling digits, then you're gonna improve the syntax or improve word learning. There has to be a specific type of design behind it, but it is possible to obtain that. So to summarize, I would say not necessarily every child with DLD has low verbal short-term memory. So as a clinician, we need to be aware of that, investigate it. If there is need to target that, then do, but selecting obviously the appropriate resources.
Lovely. And then hopefully at the next conference in a couple of years, you'll be able to come back and tell us what is the optimum intervention to support that short-term working memory to have that onward impact on word learning.
Thank you.
Lucy, a question for you, or rather a question for you, which I hope you'll be able to decode. So the comments disappeared after a certain amount of time. So I just saw the start of this comment and then it disappeared. So the contributor asked if you could expand on what exactly you meant by managing participants' expectations within the review process.
Yeah, great question. And actually it's interesting that I might have used the word participants because they're not participants. That's interesting. If I did, I apologise.
That might be me.
Oh, okay. But yeah, managing expectations, I think it's just so important, isn't it? Because I think ethically, we're obviously, as a duty of kind of researchers with kind of in a relative position of power, we can promise things and we can say we might deliver on things that actually aren't that deliverable. And I really think it's important for people to, when they are involved in things, to know specifically what that involvement is about. And also, yeah, just when they were coming up with some of the things, so like people were saying about, a really important one actually was about how interventions might be adapted for families from different cultural backgrounds, which obviously as a researcher and as a therapist, I fully go, well, we kind of do that every day in our clinical practice. But I, like with my research ahead on, I was thinking, I don't know. I really don't know if there's going to be any evidence of this out there. So I think I just wanted to be honest and say we will definitely look for this, because I think that's a really great point and so important. But just to say that it might not kind of be out there, or we might not get as much as what we want, but that's okay. So I hope that was it kind of along those lines. I think, yeah, and I would say to anyone doing kind of PPI work, managing those expectations both ways is really important, and having those kind of really open discussions from the start. So before we did any of our systematic review work or started on this project, we had some introductory like setup meetings where we together set up like a role outline.
Due to overrunning, people have been kicked out. So I'm really sorry if we weren't able to get to your questions. I think we're being strongly encouraged to end the session here. The recordings are available for 60 days afterwards, and there's the contact details for the presenters in the chat. So please do, if you've got specific questions, get in touch with our presenters directly, and I apologise for us getting cut off. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.